Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. We are at the start of the 2033 to 2034 offseason. It was a fantastic regular season for the Buffalo Wings this year. A team record 104-58 record in our 8th season in Major League Baseball. But it was a very disappointing end to the season. We had home field advantage for as long as we were alive in the playoffs, but unfortunately that was only for 4 games, as we were taken out by the 87-win Colorado Rockies 3-1 in the NLDS. So a extremely disappointing finish to the season. Several of you have commented on the last episode about the fact that we're playing as GM/manager this time around, based on some feedback from viewers in the past who wanted to see us do that. And I normally play as general manager only, and many of you are questioning my manager ability. I don't know that that's the reason why we've stunk in the playoffs compared to some of the previous playthroughs I have. When I've been general manager only, I've been delegating 99% of the decisions to my AI manager. In this simulation where I'm playing as GM/manager, I am controlling a few other things, but generally delegating 95% of the decisions to my AI bench coach. So I don't know that it's anything but just bad luck in the playoffs thus far. I am thinking about maybe just going back to being GM only, but I don't know why the AI would be stupider with the things that I have delegated to it in GM/manager mode than it would be dumber with the things that I've delegated to it in GM only mode. So I think it's probably just a small sample size and some bad luck, and a team that maybe is built more for the rigors of a 162-game season than the vagaries of a 3, 5, or 7-game playoff series. But we are going to get back up on the horse and try to ensure that this team is just as good next season as it was in the regular this year, and hopefully even better in next year's postseason, assuming that we get there. We've got a fair amount of money to spend this offseason, which will be nice. And there's really only 1 or 2 key players that we're potentially going to be losing. Vance Honeycutt, former draft pick on our team, who has been with us for 7 years in the majors now, looking for a pretty big increase as a free agent and a long contract. We'll talk about that going forward, but potentially move on from him. And then John Featherston, who's been our center fielder for the last few years. We have a final year of arbitration eligibility for him. There is potential that he would be moving into more of a backup role with a good center fielder that we have coming up from AAA, potentially in Tyreek Hardage. So do we really want to be spending $6 million-ish on a backup outfielder who, while good defensively, hasn't hit incredibly? That's another question we'll be focusing on this offseason, but those are really the only 2 key players that we may be without next season. So we've got money to fill those holes. We've got money to fill other holes, and there aren't a ton of massive holes to fill coming off of this 104-win season. Taking a look at our team statistics, we had a winning record every month of the year, except for October, when we were 1-1 in those final 2 games of the year. Second in the National League in runs scored, and we were in the top half of every offensive category except for home runs, where we were 14th. So maybe adding a big-time home run bat could help us. And the pitching staff was incredible. We were first in the National League in runs allowed, And you can see we were first, second, or third in almost every pitching category. Fifth in home runs allowed, ninth in strikeouts. But excellent pitching, really good hitting. And we were also second in the National League in defensive efficiency and fourth in zone rating. So, as I've said, I don't feel we need to make any huge changes to this team to be real competitive again next year. Just need to perhaps figure out what we need to do to ensure that we are more competitive in the playoffs than we have been, particularly this past season. Taking a look at our excellent pitching staff, we're going to have a big 1-2 punch back next year with Chris Sabatka and Sincere Shazier at the top of our rotation. Kind of feel like these guys are both perhaps better number twos than they are potential number ones. But they've both been real productive pitchers for us. Sabatka's been with us 2 years now since we made that big trade with the Dodgers for him, and he's tied for the league lead in wins both years, 17-2 with a 2.75 ERA this year and more than one strikeout per inning. Still have him for the next 2 seasons at a little over $9 million a year. So he is going to be a key member of our rotation going forward. Sincere Shazier, in a different spot of his career, the former 4th-round draft pick, the number 23 prospect in baseball. And all he did when we brought him up was go 10-3 with a 2.38 ERA and more than a strikeout per inning. Put up a 3.1 WAR in about 2/3 of a season at the major league level. I think that he is going to be even more important for us next year, less than a year of service at this point. So he's making the major league minimum right now. Wouldn't mind thinking about a longer term contract with him at some point down the line. Do appreciate his durability at this point in his career. Andrew Painter has been a starter for us for several years since we originally traded with the Phillies for him in 2027. Last year he was an all-star and still pitched 143 innings working out of the pen. Put him back into the rotation this year where he was pretty average-ish. I can't say average-ish. He was put up a 3.55 ERA, 3.48 SIERA, led the National League in fewest walks per 9 innings and had a WAR of close to 3. So all of those metrics are above average, but the 9-9 record certainly not scintillating. He will certainly be in competition for a rotation spot again next year. One of the more expensive pitchers on our team, not willing to waive his no-trade clause right now. Tend to think Painter will be a starter with us again next year. And then Harleen Susanna, who we used as our number 4 starter in the playoffs, 11-8 this year with a 4.78 ERA. A bit of a down year for him. We have signed for several more seasons at pretty reasonable money for a solid starting pitcher. Just have to kind of hope at this point we get a season closer to what we got from him in 2032 when he had the highest WAR of his career with us and the lowest SIERA he's ever had in his 4 years with Buffalo. But a good, solid, respectable number 4 starter, not making crazy money with a interesting 4-pitch arsenal. So all 4 of those guys should be back with us next year. And certainly 2 of them, Sabatka and Shazier, will obviously be in the rotation. Odds are Painter and Susanna will as well. Bryce Miller will be back as our closer next year. He's done a real nice job for us the past 3 years since he returned to Buffalo, and we moved him into the closer role with 39, 39, and 48 saves. Not making a ton of money. May not be our closer if we're able to sign a true lockdown closer, but if he does end up being our closer again, we don't have any complaints about that. Hayden Yinger was a starter for us this year. We have a team option for $3.5 million next year. Even if we use him primarily as a reliever next year, I think we can afford that. He was 12-7 this year with a 3.34 ERA. He will certainly be in the mix with the likes of Painter and Susanna for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th spots in our rotation. Doesn't have the greatest stamina at this point, but he averaged about 4 2/3 innings per start this year. So actually a bit surprising that we got 19 decisions out of him, given that a lot of times he wasn't even going 5 innings. Yohane Varejo, rookie for us this year, a 5th-round draft pick from 2028, and he was excellent. 81 strikeouts and 68 2/3 innings, ERA of under 2. I think that he will be an important right-handed arm out of our bullpen, hopefully for years to come. Brandon Noriega is a guy who we traded for in July with the Dodgers. 3.63 ERA over 22 1/3 innings, did strike out 28 batters. He was fine for us. He is a solid, respectable left-handed arm out of the bullpen. I don't know if he's worth $3.6 million. We had the Dodgers retain a good chunk of his $3.2 million when they traded him to us. Certainly could contribute, and if we don't bring him back, left-handed reliever is a role that we could probably use to look to address and use some help with this offseason. But Noriega is probably the first pitcher that I've talked about who might not be back with us next year. Franklin Heel, 3.35 ERA over 53 2/3 innings as a middle reliever, 8-2 record, so got involved in a lot of decisions. We have him signed for a few years to come at less than he was making in his final arbitration eligible year this year. So happy to have him back as a right-hander out of the bullpen. Jorge Carrillo, another guy who could be in the mix for a starting spot with us, although when we tried him as a starter the season before last, he really struggled. He was not as good out of the bullpen this year as he has been in previous seasons. We did have him on a very heavy workload, 84 games, 117 2/3 innings, 4.44 ERA, not spectacular. Did strike out more than a batter per inning. Gave up a lot of home runs, though. That said, his SIERA of 3.61 is pretty decent, although his ERA plus and his FIP minus were both below average. He's heading into arbitration, going to make high $2 million likely when we get him signed. He will be back in the mix as either a middle reliever or a potentially back end of the rotation starter. Very similar role envisioned for 31-year-old Sean Sullivan, 2nd-round pick in 2024, the last of the original Buffalo Wings still on our roster, 8 years through this playthrough. Worked entirely out of the pen this year, 10-5 record, 23 holds, 4.01 ERA. Pretty average-ish major league pitcher at this point, but he is a left-handed arm. I think he is probably less in the mix to be a 5th starter than some of these other guys that we talked about. I would put Yinger and Carrillo both as more likely to end up as a 5th starter than Sullivan, but he certainly can do that for us down the line if we need. Matthew Wenzel, a 24-year-old left-handed pitcher, 94 prospect in baseball that we traded for right at the trade deadline with the Giants. He split time between AAA Albany and the majors for us, was respectable at both levels. Still think he could get a little bit better, and he's probably got a future for us the next few years as a left-handed arm out of our bullpen. And last but not least, another left-hander, Kyle Backus. His ratings are kind of going in the wrong direction as he approaches 36 years of age. He was 6-1 with a 2.47 ERA this year, so he was still pretty effective as a left-hander, and he is still materially more effective as against left-handed batters than he is against right-handed batters at this point. He's going to be looking for about $1.5 million in arbitration, which is a little raise from where he was this year. I would say that Backus's spot is also in jeopardy. I'd be surprised if we have both Noriega and Backus back, and it's possible that neither of them are back, which would leave us with just the 2 lefties out of the bullpen in Sullivan and Wenzel. But we do have to keep in mind that we have a potential big-time lefty in Juan Estrada, another guy who should be in the mix for the starting rotation. The 26-year-old two-way player tore his PCL in his knee this past year. He had went 3-3 with a 4.64 ERA, so he hadn't been great in the early stages of the season. But that pitching profile, to me, suggests he can still be a pretty good starter with a 4-pitch arsenal of plus pitches, plenty of stamina, excellent at holding runners. So Estrada will be back as a lefty, most likely in our rotation. I would say my inclination right now would be to slot Estrada in at number 3 behind Sabatka and Shazier, and then have the likes of Painter, Susana, Yinger, Carrillo, and Sullivan competing for those 4th and 5th spots, most likely. While we're talking about Estrada, we'll also look at his batting stats. Very small sample size for him as a two-way player, but he put up a 135 WRC plus in 140 at-bats. 307 batting average plus 30 walks equals a 430 on base percentage. Real important player for us, and a guy who, if he is healthy this year, could potentially also help us with the fact that we might be moving on from the likes of Honeycutt and Featherston as outfielders. And then Jaden Hilaire, who was our Rule 5 pick this past year, out for 4 months with a torn labrum, hurt himself right at the end of the regular season. He was 2-1 with a 3.30 ERA. He'll be 25 next year. He is a guy who still has 2 option years left, so certainly will be in the mix for a spot at the back end of our bullpen. I guess he could be in the mix for a back spot at the end of our rotation with a 4+ pitch arsenal and 40 stamina. But I think some other guys on our team are better for that. And we've got plenty of guys, as we talked about, who'll be competing for those 3rd, 4th, and 5th starter spots. So Hilaire more in the mix for the bullpen for us. So feel like we're going to be bringing back most of the best pitching staff in the National League next year, and also hope to get a full season out of Juan Estrada, which should be a boost as well. So I don't feel like there's a lot for us to do with the pitching staff. If there's an opportunity for us to add a lights out number 1 starter, would obviously always love to do that. We have, as I said, over the years traded for Sabatka, Painter, and Susana, and even Yinger to try to bolster our rotation. Sabatka is the closest of those to a number 1, obviously, but if we were able to bring on a true lights-out ace and then have Sabatka, Shazier, and maybe Estrada as our 2, 3, and 4 pitchers, that would make this rotation incredibly formidable. We've been looking for an ace pitcher basically since the start of this playthrough, always trying to come up with trade offers for other teams. Clearly a young ace pitcher, the price is extremely prohibitive, and even an older, more higher paid ace pitcher, the prices are pretty much prohibitive. So no guarantees that we'll be able to do something like that or find an ace pitcher in free agency. I'm pretty confident we won't be finding an ace starter in free agency this year. But adding a true number 1 ace starter is something we could consider to do for the pitching staff. More realistically, it's maybe just adding a left-handed arm for the bullpen if we do move on from both Noriega and Backus. But otherwise, we're bringing just about everybody back. I like the quality of the pitchers on our team. Haven't even mentioned a couple guys who were in AAA who are going to be in the mix for a spot on our pitching staff next year. Isidro Ochoa, the number 84 prospect in baseball, 14-10 with a 4.52 ERA, slightly above average advanced metrics as a 23/24-year-old, mostly honestly really a 23-year-old when he played this season for AAA Albany. certainly in the mix. And then David Aranya, former Rule 5 pick, spent some time in Buffalo and some time in Albany this year. Another right-hander who will be in the mix for a spot on the major league team next year. So as I said, if we come back with these guys that we have, I'll feel really good about our pitching staff. The only things I really think we need to think about adding this offseason are potentially a left-handed reliever and then potentially a true ace starter. And I guess if we want to get creative for a true ace starter, you do need to keep in mind that some of these good solid veterans, a Painter, a Susana, a Yinger, and or some of these younger guys with talent like a Carrillo or an Ochoa, we could include guys like that in a deal to try to get a deal done. You know, if we could get a true ace starter for Ochoa, the number 484 prospect in baseball, and let's just say that Yinger is viewed as the most attractive of Yinger, Susana, and Painter by another team. If we needed to include Yinger, number 84 prospect, starting pitching prospect in Ochoa, and a couple of other top prospects to get a true ace starter, I think I would definitely do that. I just don't know that that'll be enough ammunition to potentially get a transaction for a true ace done. Turning now to our offense, which, as we talked about, was also really good this year. The only thing we don't do is hit a ton of home runs. So finding a big home run bat for this offseason is probably the key thing we're going to need to think about to improve this roster, similar to our pitching staff. I don't think we have to make huge moves, and given that we're going to have a good chunk of money, we got to hope that there's one impact player out there that we can potentially bring on board in free agency. Starting with the catchers, Adley Rutschman is definitely starting to deteriorate a bit in his batting ratings and his defensive ratings. He's going to be 36 before the start of next year. Next year is the last year that we have to have him. We've got that team option for his age 37 season at $41.5 million that we will most likely be moving on from. Had for the first time in his 5 seasons with Buffalo, he didn't reach a 4 WAR for us this year. It was 3.6. Hit 257, 23 doubles, 12 homers, 114 WRC plus. So still an above average offensive player for us this year with above average defense as well. He will be back, and we will hope to hopefully get a 4 WAR season out of him next year in what, as I've said, will likely be his final year with us. And then we brought Andres Medina, the 26-year-old, on board in a trade with the Phillies to be our backup catcher. Love the durability, love the defensive prowess, love the captain personality. Hit 243 for us with 4 homers and 15 ribbies and 115 at-bats. Kind of odd for a player who's 26 years old, but we still see some reasonably material opportunity for him to improve. And quite honestly, if he ends up a 60 contact, 60 home run power, 55 eye type player with that defensive prowess and that durability, he could be a useful catcher for us for years to come. Obviously, he is penciled in as the backup behind Rutschman for next season. Depending on what happens with our lineup and who we're able to bring on board, could see ourselves in a situation similar to what we did in the late stages of the regular season, where Medina is our everyday catcher against left-handed pitching, and we perhaps move Rutschman into a DH role against left-handed pitching to preserve his knees and his body a bit at his advanced age for a baseball player. But really happy with our catchers for next year. Don't think there is much of anything for us to do at that position. And we potentially have a starter for 2 years from now in Medina on board for when we likely move on from Rutschman. Moving on to our infielders, Joe Edwards, after a rough introduction to the majors in September of 2032, got about half a year of additional seasoning in Albany, and it seemed to make a pretty significant difference. He went from a 64 WRC plus in 2032 in the majors to an impressive 132 this year. Batted just 254. But did have 14 home runs, 50 ribbies, and 46 runs scored in just 260 at-bats. Walked 42 times, 827 OPS. Pretty versatile player defensively, although first base is really the only position where he potentially excels at with his 6'4" height and those ratings that are mediocre for most infield positions are pretty strong for a first baseman. So he is likely our first baseman next year, numbers 97 prospect in baseball, and glad to have him on board and not making much money. Deshaun Seifu, the veteran, former number 1 overall pick, is now one of the most expensive players on our team. And he had one of the best seasons of his career this past year. Led the National League in at-bats for the second time, runs for the second time, hits for the second time, and stolen bases for a 6th consecutive season. Hit 311 on the year, 119 WRC plus, and a 5 WAR on the year. Seems to be kind of the level that he is kind of settling in on over the course of his career. Seifu is going to be 30 next year. At some point, his speed will probably go a little more than it already has. Not quite as fast as he used to be, but still obviously very proficient on the base paths. Very important part of our offense. He'll be back at second base next year. We've got him signed for another 3 seasons before he'll potentially be hitting free agency. Jordan Westberg is a guy that we will likely move on from. You may remember that we signed him last offseason to a front-loaded contract, given that we had a ton of money to spend in free agency and nobody that we really wanted to spend it on. So we have a team option for him for next year at $6 million. When we get through the rest of the roster, you'll probably understand why we want to move on from him. Hit just 223 with 9 homers and 269 at-bats, was a below-average offensive player. Do like his defensive versatility, but I kind of feel like we also have Miguel Vargas in the mix, who we made a trade for with Milwaukee, another veteran who's making a ton of money, but Milwaukee kept the vast majority of his contract. And he's a similar-ish profile. He performed better for us, hitting 308 with a couple homers and only 65 at-bats. Another guy who can play both corner infield positions. Not as good defensively as Jordan Westberg is, but given that we're only going to be spending about $750,000 of our own money on him, think that that is probably a better investment for a backup infielder than Westberg at $6 million next year. Cam Collier headed into his final arbitration eligible year, looking for over $9 million. We'll likely be able to sign him for a little less than that. Hit 267 with 30 doubles, 17 home runs, 110 WRC plus. He was an above-average offensive player, although when all was said and done, his 2.5 WAR was pretty similar to what he had done the year before for us. He is certainly better than replacement level, but probably not as good as we had hoped he would become when we made the trade with the White Sox for him 3 years ago. You know, he's a 12 to 18 home run guy. His batting averages have been all over, 299, 240, and 267. A solid, respectable major league third baseman. $9 million potentially in arbitration is getting rather full as a price for him. But we'll look at the potential for the trade market or for if there's any big time third baseman out there. I tend to think we'll probably bring him back next year, but a long term contract with him is probably somewhat less likely. And our last infielder is the young shortstop Tim Hull. Batting average dipped to 249, which is the worst of his career. That said, he still had 33 doubles, 4 triples, career best 8 homers, career best 60 ribbies, career best 66 runs scored. Was a below average offensive player, but still put up a 2.4 WAR, helped by solid, if not spectacular, defense. He is at a point where he's not yet arbitration eligible, just 2 years and 92 days up at this point. So one more year for him making the major league minimum. So he'll be penciled back in as our starting shortstop next year. So I think right now what I'm thinking is Edwards at first, Seifu at second, Collier at third, Hull at short, Vargas as a utility infielder. Probably move on from Westberg and look to bring on a utility infielder who's a little better defensively than Miguel Vargas is to potentially give us some potential relief for Seifu at second and Hull at shortstop if we need it. And last but not least, turning to our outfielders. Vance Honeycutt, 8th round pick in 2024, one of the success stories from the early years of this playthrough in terms of our player development. Has been up in the majors with us for 6.5 years now. The first 4.5 years, he was a well above average and incredibly consistent offensive player. These last couple years, his batting averages have dipped to 238 and 236. Still been an above average offensive player, but not the type of player that he was in the early years of his career. He's just concluded his final year of arbitration eligibility. He's going to be turning 31 early next year. He's already fragile in terms of his injury proneness. And he's looking for over $20 million a year for 9 years. That is not a contract that I would be willing to give the former 3-time All-Star. If we could get him, 16, 17 million a year for 4, 5, maybe 6 years, if there were some team options involved, would I consider it? Yes. But I'm not sure that that's the best way for us to spend this money. So it's possible that Honeycutt may be gone next year. Now we will have the opportunity to submit a qualifying offer to him, which could be risky-ish. He is looking for over $20 million a year for 9 years. I don't know that I really want to be spending $19 million a year on him, but I would like to get some draft pick compensation if he does end up getting a long and highly paid deal with another team. So that's one decision that I'll need to think about in the coming days. John Featherston, this past year's starting center fielder, has been our starting center fielder for the last 3.5 years. And unfortunately, Featherston, over the last couple of years, his offensive production has definitely regressed. He hit 288 with us the first half season, then 276, down to 242, and then down to 235 this past year. He had been double-digit home runs 3 straight years until he hit just 4 this year. 9 stolen bases this year, but a well below average offensive player, above replacement level thanks to his defense. Like his durability, but the bat has definitely regressed a little bit from when we first brought him on board. And he's in line to be making about $6 million this upcoming season. I like the glove, and if a guy like Featherston with that good glove in center field, decent speed, durability, is your starting center fielder and number 9 hitter, you can probably be a pretty competitive team, as we have been in recent years. But Just not sure if he ends up being a backup outfielder for us, whether he's the type of guy that I want to be spending $5.5 to $6 million a year on. So similar to Honeycutt, Featherston is one of our big decisions over the next few weeks of the arbitration period. Bobby Bolig made a big trade with Pittsburgh to bring him on board last February, and he kind of did what we would have hoped he would do. His batting average did dip over 20 points from what he did in Pittsburgh to 271, but had 21 homers, 85 ribbies, pretty much right in line what he did a year earlier in Pittsburgh. 110 WRC plus, 2.7 WAR. A productive corner outfielder. The issue with Bolig is obviously going to be that he rakes against right-handed pitching, doesn't do much against left-handed pitching, and we certainly see that in his career stats, where he is a 140 OPS plus player over the course of his career against right-handed pitching, including a career worst 124 this past year with us. Against left-handed pitching, though, he's an absolute disaster with a 55 WRC plus, including a 23 this past year when he hit a .184 with no home runs and 76 at-bats. So Bolig is a flawed player, but the fact that his platoon splits favor heavily against right-handed pitching, which is what we're going to be facing 65, 75, 80% of the time. Still think he definitely has some value, and he will be back with us as a corner outfielder next year, still making the major league minimum. A couple of other outfielders who will almost certainly be back with us next year. Gavin Grahovic, picked him up in a trade with Milwaukee almost a year ago and got them to retain a big chunk of his awful contract, but we have him at a reasonable-ish amount. He is a utility outfielder for us, really just a utility player overall for us. Hit 287 with 7 homers and 216 at-bats. Played in half of our games, started about a third of our games, 115 WRC plus. He is a right-handed hitter who is reasonably adept against left-handed pitching, so certainly in the mix to potentially be in a platoon at a corner outfielder spot with a Bobby Bolig. The other thing I like about Grahovic, he can play a lot of other positions other than the corner outfield spots. Not a particularly proficient catcher, second baseman, or third baseman, but we can use him in those positions in a pinch. So he should be back as a 4th or 5th outfielder slash utility man for us next year. And then last, but certainly not least, Mike Heiner, who was our first-round pick about a year and a half ago, made his major league debut this year, and all he did as a rookie was hit 309, 25 homers, 91 ribbies, 28 stolen bases, 144 WRC plus, and a 4.1 WAR. Before he had ever played a game in the majors, we signed him to a 10-year, $66 million deal. So I think that should be a good deal for us for hopefully several years to come, even though we will be paying him more than the minimum that we would have been on the hook for the next couple seasons. Even though we had guys like Joe Edwards, who was very productive in a few months in the majors, and Sincere Shazier, who was excellent in about 4 months in the majors, would certainly view Heiner, who has already been named an all-star, as our strongest candidate for Rookie of the Year this season with the year that he just put together. So feel like with Bolig, Grahovic, and Heiner, we are pretty set at the corner outfield spots. Feel like we're set at first base with Edwards. So the question is, what do we do at center field, and what do we do at DH? And certainly guys like Honeycutt, Featherston, and even Westberg could be in the mix for those positions, but I'm inclined to kind of think that we are going to move off of them a little bit, because we do have some more talent that is not too far away. Tyreek Hardage, center fielder, 23 years old, former second round pick in 2028. Spent this year in AAA. The issue is he had two relatively long stints on the injured list, so he only got 262 at-bats. Did hit 14 homers in those 262 at-bats, stole 10 bases, hit 260. Would have loved if he would have been able to play another 70 or so games in AAA. I think he would be certainly almost completely developed if he had been able to do that. That said, he's got the same outfield range as Featherston does at this point. His error rating is lower, but he's got more speed than Featherston. And he's also, I think, at this point, a better major league hitter than Featherston. So I kind of think our answer for center fielder next year is likely Hardage, which means that we're potentially just heading into free agency needing to find a big bat to hit some home runs for us, and we really don't care where that person plays because DH is the most obvious opening that we potentially have. Obviously, if we end up bringing on a great corner outfielder, a Heiner or a Bolig could move to DH. If we end up bringing on an incredible defensive infielder, we've got the ability to mix and match with the likes of Seifu, Collier, and even Hull to maybe strengthen our defense. So I think Hardage is likely our center fielder next year. Which means that when I think about what we want to do with this team, as far as our everyday players, add one huge bat that can hit home runs and add a good defensive utility infielder who could play second or short for us in a pinch. And other than that, I don't think there's a ton that we need to do. A couple other young guys who aren't far away. Dave Zapf, former first-round pick, 5th overall in 2028, hit 274 with 32 homers in Double-A Utica this year. Certainly looks like a guy who could be helpful to us as a first baseman or a corner outfielder in the not too distant future. I mentioned Isidro Ochoa already. Nate Kimmel is another former top pick, 3rd round in 2028. You can see a lot of these 2028 guys are just about ready. Kimmel is 24 years old, hit 307, slamming extra base hits all over, 22 doubles, 10 triples, and 18 home runs for AAA Albany this year. Another guy, first baseman / corner outfielder, excellent speed, a somewhat Deshaun Seifu-esque profile, not as good in terms of his contact, maybe a little bit more home run power than Seifu. But I do feel like with the likes of Kimmel and Hardage and Zapf either able to contribute next year or at most seeming to be a year or two away, I don't necessarily feel bad moving on from both Featherston and Honeycutt because we've got a lot of guys that can play corner infield / outfield spots. Pretty much almost fully developed and ready to help at the major league level. And that, my friends, is a quick overview of how this team performed in the 2033 season and what I think our initial plan for this 2033 to 2034 offseason is. As I mentioned, most of this 104-win team is going to be back with us. We're potentially losing the left-handed relievers Noriega and Backus. But when I think about our pitching staff, if we can add a number one stud pitcher, obviously would love to do that. Other than that, probably just need a left-handed arm for the bullpen. We've got young help and guys who were in AAA this past year who could probably do a more than acceptable job out of the back end of our bullpen for us. And then thinking about our everyday players, I think we move on from Honeycutt, Featherston, and Jordan Westberg. I think Hardage in center field is the replacement for Featherston. I think between Heiner, Bolig, and Grahovac, we've got the corner outfield spots that Honeycutt manned for us covered. And as we talked about, we've got guys like Kimmel and Zapf who aren't that far away to help us in those type of roles either. Westberg, I think at $6 million compared to what we think we can get from Vargas. Westberg's better defensively, but for a guy who's probably only going to have 150, 200 at-bats over the course of this next season, I think we're perfectly fine paying $750,000 to Vargas rather than $6 million to Westberg. So I think I decline the Westberg option. I think that I do accept the option to bring Hayden Yinger back. And then the last option, I'm going to accept that as well, or I think I should accept that as well, although I can't remember offhand exactly who that is. Oh, yeah, Bryce Miller, our closer. Yeah, certainly going to bring him back for $1.7 million. That's chump change for a guy who's been as productive as he has been for us. So when I think about our everyday players, a huge bat and a good defensive utility infielder are kind of the only holes that I think we have. And we've got money to potentially bring some help on board, particularly if we decline the option from Westberg and trade away Featherston. Moving on from the two of those guys clears almost $12 million for next year off of our books. So the big question is, are there any free agents that we think are going to be available who can help us? And the answer, fortunately, this year is yes. You can see that Honeycutt is listed as one of the top free agent prospects out there. But there are a couple players with potentially monster bats who are in their late 20s. Shamar Jenneret, probably going to be the American League MVP this year, hit .328, led the league with 46 homers, 137 ribbies, also led the league in OBP, slugging, OPS, and WRC+. He would be a pure DH for us, but he is a fan favorite, 28 years old, former third overall pick. You look at what he's done over the course of his major league career, and he's put up a 134 WRC+, and he's been well above that number each of his past 3 seasons in Texas. His average season, 294 average, 35 homers, and 107 ribbies over every 162 games that he plays. Looking for massive amounts of money, close to $40 million a year if he does hit free agency, but that would be certainly an impact bat to bring on board. Joel Nelson, a little bit older, he'll be 30 before this upcoming season starts. He is fragile physically, but he too has been a guy who has been a pretty productive offensive player with a 134 WRC+ over the course of his career, and he's been well over that number each of the last 3 seasons. The injury with him, or the issue with him, is the injuries, just staying healthy. He won the National League batting title this year, hitting .330 for Montreal. But you can see he hasn't played more than 130, or he hasn't started more than 132 games in a season over the last 3 years, and he is fragile. He's looking for less money than Jenneret, but he's also older, and he's also fragile, and he's probably not quite as good offensively, even though he is a more capable and more versatile defensive player. A couple other guys, Yordan Alvarez, certainly could be an interesting left-handed bat, but he's wrecked physically. He's 36 years old, doesn't bring much to the table defensively, and he's looking for $27 million a year. I think I'd probably lean towards Jenneret rather than him, just to have the guy who is materially younger and materially healthier. Corbin Carroll, another interesting bat who's already wrecked physically, coming off of a ruptured MCL this year. Has been a very productive offensive player over the course of his career. Another guy who could play first base, left field, or DH for us. And then there's Honeycutt, who, as I mentioned, is looking for $20 million. Jerry Miller, a first baseman. Another guy who we could think about, doesn't have the home run power that I think we really would like to have in an ideal world. Is a career 293 hitter, though, so he's a good contact hitter, but kind of a 15 to 25 home run guy over the course of his career. So I think clearly the profile that would interest me the most is Jenneret. I said I just need a big home run bat, and I don't even care if the guy is only a DH. And that kind of fits Jenneret. Question is whether the Rangers will sign him over the next few weeks and prevent him from becoming a free agent or not. But there is certainly some high-end talent that we could pursue here in free agency this upcoming season. Thinking about starting pitchers, does not look like there is a true number one guy out there. Simon Pacheco, with those ratings, is somewhat interesting. 70 stuff, 70 movement, 60 control. His stamina is certainly not that of a classic number one starter. And you look at his numbers over his career, he's been an above average major league pitcher by just about any metric that you can look at. Struck out well over a batter per inning over the course of his career. Would he be one of the best 5 pitchers on our team if we brought him on board? I think he certainly would be. But I could quite conceivably see him being our number 4 guy behind Sabatka, Shazier, and Estrada. And I just don't know that I want to be spending over $20 million for that. Similar, Jackson Jobe is a guy who we've looked at in the past in the trade market. He's fragile, coming off of a 8-12 season, although his ERA and his Sierra and even his ERA plus and his FIP minus were the best they've been over the last 3 years, even though the previous 2 years he had tied for the NL lead in wins. But another guy who's looking for $20 million, who's kind of a 3rd, 4th, or 5th starter for us. Jamie Arnold, the 29-year-old, has had a pretty interesting career. Another guy who's tied for the National League lead in wins a couple straight years, and then went to Toronto this year where he won 16 for the Blue Jays. Has been an above-average pitcher over the course of his career. Going to be 30 before next season starts. Think he could certainly help us as well, looking for the mid-20s in terms of his money. But another guy who I think he's a 3 or a 4 starter. And are these guys upgrades over the likes of Painter, Yinger, Susanna, Carrillo? I think they are, but with the dollars that we are spending, the much more limited dollars that we're spending on those types of players, I don't know if it makes sense to be spending $20 million plus on a guy who's going to be at best our 3rd starter. Walbert Urena out of the Dominican is the highest ranked by our scout, at least in terms of his potential. Look at what he's done over the course of his career, though. He's been a pretty average-ish pitcher, a perfectly average-ish pitcher in terms of his ERA plus, a little better than average in terms of his FIP minus. He has been a good, solid, respectable major league starter. And he's looking for the mid-20s also. So there are starters out there that could help a lot of teams. But as I said, I don't think any of these guys potentially who are going to be on the free agent market are as good as Sabatka or Shazier. So I'm viewing them as a 3 or 4 starter for us. And as I said, with guys like Painter, Susanna, Yinger, Sullivan, Carrillo, Estrada, all making materially less money than it would take to bring any of these players on board. I think we probably mix and match for the back end of our rotation with the guys that we already have. And if there is a stud starting pitcher available in trade, we could certainly try to put a package together for that type of route. But I think if we are going to spend big money in free agency this year, it probably is to bring on a big time power bat. And quite honestly, Jenneret, Nelson, and Alvarez are the three guys with more home run power over the course of their careers than we've seen from the likes of Honeycutt. There's older guys, wrecked physically, Luis Robert, fragile, 35-year-old Ronald Acuna Jr., Jazz Chisholm Jr. in his mid-30s. There's other guys who have got some pop in their bats, but I don't know that I want to be spending big bucks on a fragile or wrecked player. So it is conceivable to me that if a Jenneret or a Nelson does end up making it to the free agent block, that we may try to spend big bucks on one of those guys. We're kind of at a situation now where, as I mentioned, we're in the last year of Rutschman next year. So it'd probably be difficult to fit a player making 35 plus million next year, but we certainly can do it. And then with Rutschman coming off the books, that really just leaves us with one player with a potentially massive contract if we do decide that Jenneret or Nelson is the way to go. Obviously, we'll also be looking at the trade market, trying to figure out if there's a big-time hitter who's maybe not making so much money that we could fit onto the team for the long-term a little more easily than the amount of money that we would need to be paying to Jenneret or Nelson. But I think that those two are the obvious guys to think about if we want to make a splash, given that a big bat who can hit home runs is probably our biggest need. And we'll be thinking about that more in our next episode. If you've got thoughts on what we should do in the free agent market, what we should do in terms of some of the arbitration decisions that we have to make that I've talked about, like Backus, Noriega, Featherston, even Collier to some degree. Certainly would love to hear those thoughts. If you've got thoughts on whether we make an offer to Honeycutt, whether we submit a QO to Honeycutt, or whether we just let him go, would love to hear those things as well. Going to be an interesting offseason, but I think we're heading into it from a position of relative strength with the players that we have signed and the money that we have them signed for, despite the fact that it was a very disappointing to the finish of the season this year for Buffalo. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.